Power, and from power resulting hierarchies pervade all societies. And there's no better way to show you a society's relationship of power than through the household, the family, and through gender relationships. Through the household, you see a reflection of the grander scale of society, the value your society puts into certain hierarchies, what power different genders hold in society, who the figures of authority are, and how different classes of people are handled. And in this video, I'll show you how to answer questions for your own world, so you can have an easy way to show off the hierarchies and power relationships of your society by simply relying on the most classic societal unit. While in today's Western world most families live nuclear, meaning parents living with their children under one roof, this hasn't always been the case. Of course, there are massive differences between time, location, and class, but let's take medieval Europe as an example, as it's the base for most medieval fantasy. Thanks to the Romans, the word family, or familia, wasn't really seen as the blood-related group of people quite just yet. I mean, it's not like the family unit as the Romans would understand it had changed that much. The family was a large group that consisted of more than just blood relationships. The core of the family was of course the man of the household, mostly the family father, surrounded by a wife and his children. On top of that came any of their household helpers, workers and servants. While in Rome many of those servants were slaves, in the Middle Ages they actually got some sort of pay. But as they were living on the estate and with the family, they were seen as part of the family. Well, in many households, cows, goats and other livestock lived with the family under the same roof, but they weren't part of it exactly. At least I think so. The man as the center of the household, living with the servants and seeing them as part of the family, it reflected the contract-bound society of the Middle Ages. Like the nobles living within the castle, which were primarily men of course, have a contract with the people living on their land, who toil both for themselves and on the land of their lords. By the way, if any of you says let's return to being a medieval peasant, return with the V of course, because they had more free time. Stop lying to yourself, please. They partied a lot on their church holidays, but on these days they just didn't have to toil on their lord's land. There was still a lot of manual labor at home anyways. A young man without direct inheritance, so most commonly thirdborn and more, usually went to another estate to become part of their family as a worker or laborer, so they can have the experience and money to toil on their own land later on, provided by the lord, of course. Women had it worse. While in the early Middle Ages the lower amount of cultivated land meant that women weren't shoved to another family as the bringers of offspring that quickly, the high yields of the High Middle Ages meant way more suitable men were available, so women had to be married off earlier, which in turn caused an increase in population numbers. Towns and city folk had it a bit different. While many non-inheriting men were usually sent to different artisan guilds to learn the trade of that guild, where they again turned into another family member of the guild's family. Women had it worse. Women usually became servants or were married off again, especially the former was harsh, as an unmarried woman in the city had to find a familia to work under really quickly, or they'd just be thrown out of the city. But if you found the right family to work for, you could make quite a comparatively good buck. I won't talk that much about noble families and households, as they deserve their own video, but imagine them to be very male-dominated, in a sheer quantity sense, as the whole retinue of a knight, for example, was part of his family and household. But the male-dominated society of the Middle Ages was also reflected in gender differences, of course, which are a huge part of the familial hierarchy. A woman part of a family was automatically subordinate to their and or the man of the household. A single woman living with their family of birth had to submit to her own father. A single woman working at another's household had to submit to their father. A married woman had to submit to her husband, who controlled her whole identity and life. If she's a single woman without a household, she's still subservient to her lord, to the point that if the woman gets pregnant, despite being unmarried, the lord had to be compensated. The rights of women varied the most between the times, the location and social class, like always. There were many noble girl bosses around, but those were the exception to the grim rule. In the lower strata, the records are next to non-existent for individuals. But depending on the part of Europe, there were female freemen living as tenants or owning their own land. There are records from political and judicial participation of women, both things usually reserved to the father of the family, who had both political and judicial right over his women. When the man went to war, the mother of the family usually became the authority figure in the family. And well, a good king always needs a good queen at his side, which means women certainly exerted their power, both within the household and outside, through their husband. There's a hamstring of factors neither sociologists, anthropologists and so-called sociobiologists completely agree on when talking about how things became like that. But this is a world building video, so have an explanation for yourself on your hand. So before we get to the questions, I'll ask you to think about how families work in your world. Maybe you have already a vague idea, so type them out in the comments for me to read. And don't forget to like and subscribe, of course. And to create an interesting family culture and to develop the traditional gender roles along the way, you first have to reflect on your culture's and society's power structures and values, both of which usually stem from the material conditions making up your culture. Pro tip: think of economics, spirituality, which in a fantasy world usually includes magic, and living conditions before anything else. So what are these like? How does the average person earn their bread within your culture's setting? How spiritual and religious are people? What are their values derived from religiously? And of course, how does magic and spirituality as a whole play into it? What are their living conditions? The latter and the first question hugely depend on each other, of course, but especially in a fantasy world, magical anomalies, monsters and whatever else might play a large factor in that. Having a broad idea of this helps with the overall structuring of your family and power relationships. So think of the crunch. Who has the authority within the family and how does that reflect within your society? What are the relations to the ones with less authority in the family? What are the children treated like? And how are inheritances handled? And what happens with the people who get nothing? Who else besides blood relatives might be part of the family? Family relationships can get pretty wild, depending on the society. There are still many societies out there with vastly different understandings of kinship than we have. But this video is less about that. If you are interested in kinship structures, I can make a video about them one day, of course. And well, lastly, gender relations. What are the gender roles of your society? How are they reflected in the family structures? And how are they reflected in society overall? In what way plays spirituality, magic and religion a role in all of it? And what are the differences in authority and economical matters? Now let's turn to an example in my world. You'll recognize it from today's historical examples, even though its influences don't come from medieval Europe per se. The Orphenian people are very magic focused, more so than any other societies on the continent. Magic, the connection to magic, and magical prowess plays a huge role in the societal standing of the average Orphenian. Magic obviously doesn't mean just spells. A strong warrior who enhances their body with magic counts just as much. Their reliance on magic and the fact that magic doesn't discriminate, with asterisks, The society is pretty open towards anyone who embraces their culture and language, while everyone else is seen as rather barbaric. And of course, magic had a big role in how gender roles and familial power relationships developed as well, as magic doesn't discriminate between genders either. The gender roles for high society developed relatively equal, while lower society, which is generally magicless, picked it up anyways. In general, gender isn't really a topic for most people, while there are certain religious priesthoods and certain warrior and wizard castes that are gender exclusive. Holding power, dominance and prestige is the main factor of authority for the Orphenians. And this reflects in family matters. Marriage is seen as a primarily bureaucratic matter. You marry for the whole purpose of procreation. There are no issues, asterisks, with two people marrying each other who are in love with each other. But primarily, marriage is a contract between two representatives of two different families who aim to gain something out of the marriage. In this case, of course, it's both offspring, and depending on who brings what into the marriage and who belongs into whose family, the other family gains more or less compensation. Especially richer and more prestigious families gain lots of money by letting other families marry into their own family. But what is a family for the Orphenians? The typical family consists of father and mother, the children their slaves, but not the freeborn employees, even if they might live within the same household. While the final authority is held by either father or mother who came from the more prestigious family, this is only the case for direct familial matters. Many friction points and larger decisions are held by marriage contract anyway. Both mother and father have their own say in political matters and can stand on their own in judicial matters. Only the children are basically their parents' property until they are old enough, meaning 25. And well, not in the same way as the family's slaves, of course. The children still have rights after all. But the thing is that the Orphenian model leaves many freedoms for the married. Neither partner is sexually bound to one another, nor do they have to love each other. Their only duty is to fulfill the marriage contract and to raise children together, so they at least try to be accommodating to each other in some way. This familial relationship is a bit reflected in their pantheon, by the way. Oh, and once the marriage contract is basically fulfilled, many seek a divorce. A new contract might be lucrative after all. A marriage is one of the prime tools for upwards mobility. That's it for today's video, world builders. If you liked it, tell me about how the families in your world are run and how resulting gender relationships are handled. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. See ya!